Sup, Briskevsky. I happen to have it on good authority that the Necron Monolith is actually just terrain. So if you factor in the price of, oh my god, are they really that expensive? Well, let's hope all those hours of watching Black Magicraft videos were worth it and see if we can't make our own. From what I could find in my research, the monoliths are roughly 6 inches square by 8 inches tall. So that's what I'm going to be aiming for. It's not a perfect measurement, but anyone who cares that much isn't going to let you run these anyway. Now I'm going to be working with one of the most versatile materials out there, dollar store foam core. I started by marking and cutting out a 6 by 6 inch and a 4 by 4 inch squares from the foam core. I'm just using a cheap box cutter for this. If you've never cut foam core before, make sure your cuts are done in multiple light passes instead of trying to make the cut all at once. You'll get a cleaner cut and have more control if you do. For the side panels, start by marking a 6-inch line for the bottom, then add a 5-inch line at its midpoint with a 4-inch line centered on the top of it. Then you just connect the ends of those lines to finish the outline. After getting all the parts cut out, I beveled the inside edges so I could have sharper corners and to give the hot glue somewhere to go. I don't really like hot glue, but I'm using it for this project since Mod Podge would take too long to dry and super glue will melt the foam. After getting everything glued together, I removed the outer layer of paper from the foam core. I then used a ruler and a ballpoint pen to score lines into the foam at 1-inch intervals going up the sides of the pyramid. After those were added, I put in the vertical lines to complete the brickwork, offsetting the lines a little bit on each layer. Once I had all of the lines scored in, I rolled a ball of tinfoil over everything to add some extra texture. Then I went over the whole thing with some spackle. This serves a few purposes. It'll seal the foam, fill in any gaps in the panels, and add a little bit of extra texturing. The spackle does take quite a while to dry, so I did wait overnight between layers. Now that I've got the pyramid finished, I need to make the guns for it, and the official one also has a big gem on top that I want to try and emulate. Instead of a crystal on top, I'm planning on a large altar with a skull. Since this is for Necrons, I want the skull to look mechanical and alien. Pulling a bunch of crap from my bits boxes, I got to work. I started by cutting apart a couple of cheap Halloween skulls. I used a couple of toy bracket looking things to extend the jaw. I'm using super glue and baking soda to hold them together. For those of you who don't know, baking soda acts as a catalyst for cyanoacrylate based glues and will cause them to dry almost instantly. It'll also mix with the glue to create a material similar to concrete, which is good for filling gaps and building up the connection point between parts. After I had the jaw adjusted, I removed the back part of the skull to stretch out the cranium. I went through a few options for this before settling on the front part of the water tank from a squirt gun. After I had the tank glued in, I added the back part of a different skull to complete the extension. I then cut apart a small toy gun to create a couple of hydraulic pistons in the jaw. I also added some ridges and a paneling using a couple of those disposable floss holders. I finished the whole thing out by adding a few mechanical looking panels to the skull. Once I was happy with everything, I got the spackle back out and used it to fill in gaps and blend the different parts together. Moving on to the guns, I started with these half spheres left over from a couple of gun plug kits. I removed the interior plastic to give me more space to work and used some bone decorations to create mounts for them. Then I just started to build them up using various bits and bobs from my collection. I didn't really have anything planned for this, I just made it up as I went. Once I had the 4 cannons put together, I once again turned to the magical material spackle. Once the spackle dried on the skull and guns, I was able to sand them down and really blend everything together. Once they were finished, I could start thinking about how to attach them. For the weapons, I just cut a slit in the corners and glued them in. For the skull, I found this weird end cap thing and some skeletal hands that should work for my altar. Unfortunately, the hands are almost flat and aren't very dynamic. To fix them, I turned to humanity's first tool, fire. Using a small tea candle, I heated the plastic and bent it into shape. Do be careful if you do this. It's very easy to light the parts on fire or burn yourself on the molten plastic. With that finished, the construction of the first monolith is completed. For the second monolith, I wanted something a lot more geometrically complex and to rely less on my random bits to build it. So I turned to 3D modeling and templating to make it. There's a free download for the template in the description if you want it. I also made one for the first pyramid if you want to make that one without having to measure anything. The second monolith is quite complicated and you're going to be needing between 1 and 8 of each part. So I'm going to split it up into 3 sections and describe how to construct each one separately. Starting with the center. If editing me didn't mess up, you should be seeing the parts and counts of what you'll need for it. The side panels go together in numerical order, but you need to pay extra attention to the bevels on panels 4, 5, and 6, since they all have at least one bevel on the outside face. They go together like this, wrapping around the corners of the pyramid, the pattern repeating 4 times around the outside. I ended up creating a new texture roller for this, hoping to get a more consistent brickwork for the pyramid, but it ended up not working that well. Using texture rollers with foam requires using a lot of force and doesn't leave as deep of an indent as I would have liked. In the end, I think the pen method is the superior one for this. Unfortunately, I'm not the most precise builder, which is going to cause me some problems as I continue with this project. The increased complexity means that any errors are going to multiply across the build. I do get it to work, but it's not as neat as I was hoping it would be. Next, we'll work on the top section. The top does have the most individual pieces, but it's pretty simple to put together. Start by assembling the octagon. Do note that the sides are rectangles and not squares, and it's not necessary to bevel the top edges of the octagon. Once that's put together, it gets glued to the top of the center section. The sides should line up with the sides of the cutouts. The middle piece gets glued on next and should line up with the corners. The top pyramid is pretty straightforward and is just alternating the corners and side panels before gluing on the top section. Moving on to the bottom, the geometry is really unintuitive here, so the best advice I can give for it is to just look at the picture and assemble it the same, bro. That's what I ended up having to resort to. For assembly, I started from the middle panels, then worked my way out. Overall, this is probably the section that suffered the most from my sloppy building techniques. I ended up trimming the top edges to get things to line up more, but even then, things weren't as neat as I wanted them. Honestly, at this point, I was considering tossing the project and instead making a 3D printed version of it, but I did decide to press on with it in the end. In my experience, projects like this all tend to go through a crappy looking phase, and I was hoping I could hide a lot of my sins with spackle and paint. It all ended up working out in the end, and one of the advantages of working with something that's supposed to be ancient like this is that you can sell a lot of flaws as weathering. I may still make a 3D printable version of this in the future, but for now I am happy with what I have. After applying a couple layers of spackle, I moved on to making the weapons for the second monolith. I created them from some spare parts I had left over from my Necron warriors. Each one was made out of 2 Goss flayers and 1 Goss reaper. I started by removing the handles, the bayonets, the tubes, and part of the frames from each of the weapons. I then glued the guns together with the heat sinks of the flares pointing out and used the old frames to create new supports for them. Then I reused the tubing to connect up the different sections of the cannon. Finally, I glued one of the handles back on to the bottom to create the mounts. I think they turned out pretty good. The only problem with them being they're too small on the monolith and end up getting lost in the silhouette. Now we can finally move on to the moment of truth and find out if my spackle layers are enough to seal the foam. I'm using a rattle can primer on these, and if they aren't sealed properly, the spray paint will end up melting the foam and destroy a lot of my hard work. I started with the first monolith since it would be the easier of the two to remake if I had to. It didn't end up disintegrating under the spray paint, so with some increased confidence, I moved on to priming the second monolith. I painted them using the same paint scheme as my bases, and since I've had literally 0 people asking me for the recipe, I figured I should probably share it. Pretty much the whole thing was done using cheap craft paints. For the stones, I started with a base coat of Folk Art Pueblo. Then I made a wash out of Apple Barrel Tuscan Red. Finally, I do a dry brush of a mix of the Pueblo and Folk Art French Vanilla. For the copper, I start with a base coat of Deco Art Metallic Copper. Then I make a wash out of Apple Barrel Acapulco and Black. Then, using a torn off corner of a makeup brush, I sponge on the Acapulco and then the base copper. Finally, for the bones, I started with a base coat of Folk Art Parchment with a little gray added. Then I did a wash made out of Apple Barrel Burnt Umber, Black, and just a touch of Tuscan Red. I finished them by hand painting some highlights using just the straight parchment color. In addition to that, I did paint the cannons on my second monolith following the paint scheme for the rest of my Necron army. To get a detailed rundown, check out this video here. Truthfully, I did rush this a little bit since I was tired of working on this project and I wanted to be finished. I may come back and do some touch-ups at some point, but for now, they're good enough. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how these have turned out. They aren't quite perfect, and I could definitely nitpick a lot of things on them. That said, I do think they fit in with the rest of the army, either as a unit or as a terrain piece. But what do you think? Would you let me proxy these at your table, and which one do you prefer? For the next video, I think I'm going to try speed painting some Space Marines, so go ahead and subscribe if that sounds like something you're interested in. And remember, until next time, we all have our own hobby journey, and I'd like to thank you for joining me on mine.